Hello everyone. In this tutorial, what I'll be covering is the PHP for loop, and the for loop functions very similar as the while loop. However, it is just coded a different way and contains a little more code. So the first thing that I'm going to do is show you the basic layout for a PHP for loop. So I'm going to write in a comment block an example. And as you could have predicted, the way you start a for loop is by writing the word for. Then we're going to open a parentheses. And next we're going to initialize a counter. Then we're going to type a semicolon. Then we're going to evaluate a certain condition. End that with a semicolon. And next we're going to increment a counter. And we're going to close our parentheses, open a curly brace. On the next line, we're going to execute a segment of code, and then we're going to close our curly brace, and that's the end of the for loop. So let's quickly reevaluate what's going on here. As you can see, we have a couple of things taking place on this first line here. We are initializing a counter. We next created a certain condition that we need to evaluate to see if it's true or false. And lastly, we are incrementing the counter. And most importantly, each one of these different expressions are separated by a semicolon, except for this last expression, which is incrementing the counter. Now, the counter gets incremented after we execute this code. So as we cycle through, as we loop through this for loop, we continue to increment this counter after each loop. So again, after we execute this code, the next thing that we're going to do is increment this counter, and then we're going to reevaluate the condition. And then if that condition is true, we're going to execute this code again and again, repeat the process over and over until this condition evaluates to false. So let me give you an example just so I can make it a little bit more clearer to you. So I'm going to write in a comment for loop example. So I'm going to say for counter is assigned 0. Here I'm just initializing my counter variable. You can name this anything you want, but I'm going to name it counter. And then I'm going to create a condition. I'm going to say if counter is less than or equal to 10. Again, that's the end of that expression. I'm going to say counter increment. And we remember that 2 plus signs mean to increment the counter by 1, add 1 to counter, or add 1 to whatever value is inside the variable counter. Next, open my curly brace. I'm going to say echo counter is now, I'm going to say counter, then we're going to put a horizontal line, put a double quotes in it with a semicolon, and then I'm going to end this for loop. All right, so let's reevaluate what's going on here. Again, I initialized my counter to 0, and I could have initialized it to 2 or 3, 4, 5, whatever I wish to. But again, just to make it easier to understand, I initialized it to 0. And then I created a condition that I want to evaluate before I execute this loop and after I execute this segment of code. So I created a condition that I want to evaluate to see if it's true or false. So after I execute this code, I'm going to increment my counter, or I'm going to execute this expression. So I'm going to increment my counter by 1 because I specified right here that I wanted to increment it by 1. So really, I could have put counter is equal to counter plus 1 instead of 2 plus signs, and that would have done the same thing. So if you want to increment it by, say, 5 each time we finish executing the code that's between this curly brace, and again, it could be multiple lines of code here. After it gets done executing that code, it's going to execute this expression that you specify here. And then after we execute this expression, we're going to execute this expression, and we're going to evaluate it to see if it evaluates to true. If it evaluates to true, we're going to execute this segment of code again. And again, we're going to execute this expression again, recheck our condition. If it's false, we're going to end this for loop and continue on with the rest of our code. So with that said, let me just go ahead and change this back to what we originally had. and go ahead and save this and see what happens. I'm going to call it for loop.php. And I'm going to go into my browser, type localhost, the PHP basics. Let's change this to for loop. And as you can see, it echoes out as it should all the way down to 10. So again, like I said, going back over here to the code, I could have typed counter equals counter plus 2. Hit save, refresh my browser. And as you can see, it's going by 2s, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So just for a comparison, let me just convert this for loop into a while loop. So as you can see with this while loop example, it has obviously taken up more lines to actually code the same exact thing that this for loop example is accomplishing. So again, here I'm just initializing my counter. I had to create a separate line for that. I also started my while loop. Again, here we're evaluating our condition just as we did up here with the for loop. And then on the next line, I start to output my information. And then next I increment my counter. And then I come back up here to this while condition and evaluate the condition. And again, repeating this process. But with the for loop, we do all of that in this one single line. So as you can see, the for loop is more compact than the while loop. However, either method you use is perfectly fine. So that does conclude this tutorial, and hopefully now you understand how to implement a PHP for loop. So be sure to take the online quiz at the phpbasics.com to ensure that you understand the core concepts for a PHP for loop, and I will see you in the next video.